Hi everybody. Welcome to Where's the Body? The case for Somatic Futures. Grateful that you could all attend here today. So my name is Rodney Frederickson. I'm a design futurist, abstract artist, facilitator, coach and mentor, etc., etc. And one of the things I'm most passionate about is challenging and inspiring creative growth through art, design, and futures. I feel like there's not only an alchemy within each of those, but a really fascinating alchemy across. So it's one of the things that I've been pouring my energy into these days. So one of the things I'd like to do is just acknowledge um, all those who have contributed and supported myself along this journey. I do feel like we're all on journeys, and I'm grateful that we are able to connect and meet today. The older that I get, the more this saying from Africa, I am because we are, becomes, true. I strive to be the best expression of the relationships and interconnections that I am a part of. So I'm just grateful for you all. I love this quote by Susan Mitchell. The world is wily, doesn't want to be caught. Why it speaks to me is that no matter the frameworks, the paradigms, the diagrams, the methods and tools, life continues to be slippery. It always finds a way to slip out of what we think it is or what we think it should be, and so forth. There's an aliveness that is hard to capture, but worth bearing witness to. So I'll start off by sharing a pivotal moment that was a huge wake-up call for me when it came to my deepening within futures. So back on November 4th, 2022, I was part of the Designing Sustainable Futures program, which was a international cohort, maybe like 15 to 20 plus people, hosted by Institute of the Future and Poly Design. It was the first of its kind. There were several courses within it over the course of 8 weeks. One particular one was a world building class facilitated by a gentleman named Jacques, who is a director and a futurist at Institute of the Future. His provocation was imagine a world in 2035 where humans no longer required water to share what happened. And when he shared that provocation, something interesting happened. A woman there had raised her hand and said that she felt uncomfortable with this, that there are people who don't have access to clean water today. Who are we to imagine a world without water? And clearly she was frustrated and flustered by this. Um, and I was curious to see how he would respond to it. So he began to explain that this work with futures can be and sometimes should be a provocation. It helps to challenge assumptions about the future, reveal values, and etc. And then he continued on um, with the activity. At the end of the activity, he asked if anybody had questions, and I did this and said, time out. Can we talk about what just happened here? Somebody had a visceral reaction to the topic. I'm not seeing anything in the methodologies or frameworks that acknowledges this kind of affect, how to hold space for it, how to support it, and realize there's a story emerging. And it's like, how do you acknowledge this? Because there's a story emerging here. And how do you work with that story and weave it into the speculative narratives that we're trying to create here? So outside of folks saying, wow, that's a really good question, nobody really had an answer for it. And that really stood out to me. So in putting this presentation together, I went back and looked at my journal notes. And these were a couple things that I wrote, like, how do we allow any stories, uncomfortable or not, to kind of rise up and be shared and acknowledged? Um, my thinking at the time was, is there a somatic technique that could be used or required to just just to help the person be open to continuing on with doing the work and so forth, but not to remove the discomfort, but as a way to work with it, to create more space, to see where it leads us, to reveal. So, in order to understand why that stood out to me, why I'm even talking about somatic stuff or any of this, we're going to flash back what happened earlier in that year. December 21st, 2021, I was in a car accident, which happened to be traumatic because it was the fifth car accident in my life. That I've been physically struck as a pedestrian twice, once as a child, 6 years old, and once as an adult at 29. Where the red arrow is, um, this is where I was parked at a stopping light, and a car, vehicle one, ran a red light and crashed into several cars, including my own. It was a minor head injury, but again, being the fifth car accident in my life, it was traumatic. So immediately after the doctor checked me out, I told him and I said, I'm concerned about PTSD. Like I've had trauma before, and I could tell something wasn't right in my body. I've done therapy before, talk therapy, and so forth. So I started researching online, particularly looking for an approach that specifically worked with trauma. I came across something called somatic experiencing, which was created by Peter Levine, who observed in the 50s and 60s that animals faced with all kinds of threats do not exhibit the same symptoms of trauma like humans do. And he built an approach based off of those findings. One of the things that stood out to me this video I was watching was number 2. Trauma is in the body, not the event. I'd never heard anything like this before. It was really a paradigm shift. So I sought to find a therapist who was also certified in somatic experiencing in my state, and I found one fairly quickly and started to do the healing work with her. And one of the things that I noticed that it was a very different approach to healing, as opposed to cognitive therapy or talk therapy, which feels very top that down. This was very bottom up, really taking into account like what's happening in my body in the session itself. The interventions I'd never experienced before. So I'd be talking at one point, and the therapist may say, Rodney, can I ask you to pause and scan what's happening in your body because your words are speeding up? And I always consider myself pretty self-aware. And this was brand new to me. Like, oh, wow, I didn't even realize my words were speeding up. And I kept telling the therapist back at the time, this is way before I dove into futures. I kept telling her, I'm learning this approach, but I feel like it's not just for me. I feel like there's something here that I need to do with, but I don't know what it is. So while I'm doing all this work and working at my job, 2 weeks later, my father dies unexpectedly in the hospital. I didn't realize at the time of the car accident, when I was getting checked out at the hospital, my brother actually had him put in the hospital because of some health complications and so forth. So his passing was unexpected. So one of the things, as my therapist said at the time, was like, you've got like a trauma stack happening here, like rail cars on top of each other. And the car accident was enough. But seeing the impact, although my relationship with my father was complicated, loss is still loss. But seeing the ripple effects throughout my family and how it was landing in, different relatives and so forth, made this a really trying time. So from there, I just immersed myself in what I could do to stay afloat. which was work as a digital product design director, my day job, therapy, sometimes in the middle of the day, and as a painter, abstract painter, I paint. So it was work, therapy, paint, work, therapy, paint, go for a walk, exercise, and so forth. But whatever I could use as a resource, to stay afloat and heal. And after several months of that, I just hit a wall. Like that was not sustainable. I needed to get away. But I didn't know where to go. I love outside. I love being in nature. It's really restorative. So this leads to my first premise, the realization I had at the time for making the case of somatic futures. What I learned was our atomic nervous system responds to change in three different ways. The ventral vagal state is when we feel safe, we feel relaxed. Parasympathetic nervous state, we're in rest mode, we're in digest food mode, and so forth. Sympathetic state, flight or fight. We're anxious, we're angry, we're agitated, so forth. And the third state, freeze. Whatever's happening is too overwhelming. Maybe we're depressed, maybe we feel immobilized. So not only we may oscillate between these different states, but we can experience a mixture of states, as well. So I found a place to go to get some respite. I went to the Mega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York, which was a retreat center. Huge campus next to a forest and a lake, meditation, yoga, like all these things. They have programs. But they have a thing where you can create your own retreat, which I did. So my everyday was Zazen or Zen meditation, painting, Ashtanga yoga, writing, studying, walking, eating, talking with others, listening. And then out of nowhere, this little whisper comes to me, design futures. And I never really heard the term before. I didn't know what it meant. And my first thought was like, I'm not here to think about work or career. I'll dismiss this. But then I realized I'm doing all this inner work to heal and grow and all these things. And this whisper comes to me out of nowhere. Maybe I should respect this, pay attention to it. So I started taking some online classes, Coursera, for futures thinking, to see if there was really something here. And it was. Something was evolving or, growing in me about this, which led to my second premise. There's a wisdom in the body. If we could just learn to quiet enough, pay attention enough, our nervous system, our body is always there for guidance and support. So after that, after my vacation and coming back to work, I would tell folks I'm serving the whisper of this design futures. So I talked to a coach at work, told her about what I was doing, and she said, "Oh, you got to talk to my friend Phil Balakis." I said, "Who's that?" "He's a futurist, and he used to lead the Design Futures Initiative." I was like, "Oh, thank you, universe." So he was hosting a 2-day workshop on how to facilitate futures workshops, which I attended. And I was bitten by the futures bug. I was like, "Oh, this is it. This is what I need to be doing." From there, I joined the Designing Sustainable Futures program. And on the right, you could see all the courses that were offered. It was an 8-week program. And I have to say, this is one of the most transformative experiences I've ever had in my life. There was something about it that was just life-changing. And I remember the day before the very first class, I went back in my notes that night, which was going to be a Design Futures class. This idea of somatic futures, that's all it was a name, came to me and I wrote it down. And I remember thinking, oh, that's kind of cute. And I kind of dismissed it. So Jake Dunnigan was teaching Design Futures course, and he had this term he called cognitive ecosystem, which I thought was fascinating. Basically, he was saying when we do this work, we need to understand what's in the room. Where are people at with their assumptions about the future, um, their ideas, their perspectives? And I added in my notes also, are people coming with trauma histories relevant to the topics being explored for the futures? And what's being introduced in the room? And then I wrote in my notes after doing a system or a systemic design class, I felt like I could see like there was an affect to doing this work, that I began to suspect that maybe doing the work in the process, the affect is potentially more impactful than the intended outcome of the work itself. And I began to think about of the intended changes that could happen without the awareness of how we are changing along the way by doing this type of work and the implications of that. At the same time, at my job, I had pitched to some senior leadership folks to create a first of its kind of design futures initiative team. The remit was to create new client offerings because I worked for a consultancy, as well as cultivate strategic foresight as a skill throughout the firm. I had a team of about 8 to 10 people, different levels, different roles, associate, senior partners, and so forth. Which leads to my third premise. I realized at the time there's an affect to doing futures work, from the process, from the output, from the interactions that we have with people, and so forth. So coming into the new year of 2023, I was on fire. I attended the Houston Foresight program, which was amazing. Andy Hine and the work that he's doing down there. I love the fact they were teaching foresight with systems thinking woven in, which I thought was amazing. I got the award for asking the most questions, which I'm really proud of. And my question, even then, in talking to some folks down there, is like, where's the body in this work? I kept feeling that I could see the rigor intellectually and otherwise, but I kept feeling like some of the foresight approaches felt like it was happening from the neck up. Also, during this time, one of the things that I had been doing for years on the side is I study herbalism on the side. I craft my own herbal tea blends. I buy my herbs wholesale. So I started diving in deeper because there's a concept in herbalism, excuse me, called herbal actions. Essentially, the impact an herb may have on the human body. So some herbs can help your body adapt to stress. Some herbs may help you with mucus. Some herbs may stimulate lactation or lactating milk for women, for pregnant women. So about 30 plus. And I began to wonder, this idea of herbal actions, can it be like a guide or a paradigm to think about the possible implications of the futures we're imagining on bodies? And also, the team was growing. We had some clients lined up who were interested. We envisioned our aspiration to have this global community around design futures. But I got to see firsthand the challenge of working with people who are thoroughly engaged and excited, excuse me, but have no training whatsoever, mixed with people who have some experience doing futures, but no training whatsoever. And here I was getting the formal training, and as fast as I could, trying to help people become more future fluent. And the challenge with that, I began to appreciate a lot more because essentially I felt like we're conditioned to, on clock time, to see past, present time in some linear fashion. So the idea of introducing an S at the end of futures and saying, well, it's plural, is like telling people the earth isn't flat, it's round. Like, it's just conceptually hard for some people to really take in. And then from there, I attended Institute of the Futures Foresight Essentials program. which was amazing. They are super tool heavy, um, taught very differently than Houston's program, but very interesting. And my question there as well was, where's the body here? How are we attending to what's happening in the body? And then layoffs came, a wave of layoffs. And the tricky thing was, with all that foresight training, I could anticipate the possibility of a second round of a layoff. And I imagined the scenario, and I imagined what I might do in that scenario if I would get caught up in the wave. But what I didn't anticipate was how heartbreaking it would be. And it was such an insightful epiphany, because I realized, with all that imagining, with all the signals and evidence for this plausible future, I hadn't taken it to the step of imagining that I had these strong relationships with people. I was part of a community. I had created my own community with this Design Futures team. And the experience of being torn apart from that, how some relationships felt broken or strained or frayed, some grew stronger, and heartbreaking for a lot of people. And I realized, like, how can we anticipate that in our futures? How can we feel some inkling of that in our imaginings? So one of the things I realized for my fourth premise for making the case, the methodologies, frameworks, and tools that I've been exposed to, and I put an asterisk around it because I know things are changing today, they're not really suited to acknowledging, supporting, and holding space for the affect on people that may be happening when doing futures work, especially those with trauma histories related to the topics that we're exploring. So after the layoff, I was like, all right, I got no team. I've got all this training. I have no job. What am I going to do? And this little whisper came up for me that it was time for wildly things. It was time to go experiment. So I love avant-garde jazz, and one of my favorite artists is Sun Ra. And I'm a fan of anybody who literally claims to be from another planet, which he claimed to be from Saturn. So I'm a big fan of that. But during this time, I remember one of his quotes that stood out to me. The possible has been tried and failed. Now it's time to try the impossible. So with that, I reached out to a friend and a director of Rutgers Idea Academy for undergrads, which is Innovation Design Entrepreneurship Academy, and said, hey, Futures and Foresight amplifies the scope and impact of design. I would love to do a workshop. And she said, you can do whatever you want. So throughout 2023, I actually created and facilitated 3 of the 4 workshops that you see here. My first one was Navigating AI's Impact on the Future of Work. The second one, Why So Human? Visions of Embodiment in the Age of AI. And the last one was Echoes of Change, Ethical Waves of Product Impact, which was a mini workshop. Patterns of the Veil is a new workshop I'm doing at the college this year, which will introduce dream work and the language of dreams into futures as a way of using for analogous inspiration when envisioning alternative futures. So I'd like to share some of the experiments that I actually did and invite us to actually maybe do a little something here in the Zoom if you are all okay with it. But before I go ahead, I know that was a lot to download. Any questions or thoughts before I continue?
This is really, really interesting, and I'm so thankful to you for sharing this. I'm really curious about the herbal connection, and I'm wondering whether you can elaborate a little bit more on the connection between that and like futures work. Is it just like thinking about the future action of the herb on the body. Is that the link there?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. For me, it's not just that. It's when it comes to herbalism, there are several different schools of thought in terms of approaches. But the most consistent way to think about it is you look at the whole person, not just their symptoms, but you find out their lifestyle, what's going on, and so forth. And rather than think in a reductionist, kind of allopathic way, oh, I have a headache, let me get aspirin, which can be helpful at times when there's something acute, it's more holistic. So, what's your sleep like? What's your diet like? And so forth. So, then you may think of an herbal action that addresses some of these symptoms, but the intent is to get to the underlying root and blend these together into a formulation that's right for the individual and their physiology. So for me, part of the connection is I feel like and this happens in design too. When we think about scale and populations and abstract outward, the trade off is that we lose the nuances of the wholeness of people. They become data points. And these those little pieces of context offer up an opportunity to rather than kind of reduce it to something very simple, to imagine a bigger whole context in which these things reveal their interconnectedness. So for me, it's not just the herbal actions, which is fascinating to me, um, but also realizing that some things may have multiple effects. Herbs typically have multiple effects, but there's a synergy there. There's some herbs called nervine herbs, which stimulate or support or give rest to the nervous system. It's interesting to me that a bunch of these herbs also aid digestion. Well, why is that? What is it about aiding digestion that relates to the nervous system? So when we think about doing futures work, how do we account for the discoveries we've had with the gut-brain axis, and how our microbiome actually helps shades our moods, thoughts, and behaviors in some ways? It opens up the sense of agency. But if we reduce the individual to certain data points, we miss all this other context around them. So for me, that's where I kind of see the link and the opportunity to really invite a deeper sense of wholeness in the room when we think about who these futures are for, and the people that we're actually working with to actually do that. I know that's a long-winded answer, but I hope that kind of hits the mark a bit.
Yeah, I think I'm starting to get a sense of that link. Thank you for that. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So what I'd like us to do is imagine that aliens have landed across the world. The only thing that we know is they don't understand our languages, but somehow they respond to the frequency of bees. So on the count of three, I want you to take a deep breath in the Zoom, and we're going to hum as loud as we can on that single breath. Ready? One, two, three.
Mm,
Mm.
mm.
So I'll ask each of you, what happens to the aliens next? What's the first thing comes to mind?
It will hum back.
Great. Okay. Who's next?
For some reason, I keep seeing the word surprise. So like they're
Mm,
surprised that we're able to connect with them in that way.
nice. How about you, Yanru?
It's interesting. Yes.
Okay. So what was the point of this? So this is something that I did, that I do in meetings and warm-ups in my Design Futures workshop, it's a way of using a preposterous future to evoke somatic awareness. So when we hum or sing or chant, our vocal cords oscillate and it massages the vagus nerve running from our brain throughout our body. And that helps our body shift from maybe a sympathetic nervous state, flight or fight, activation, to parasympathetic, more relaxed, more open, and so forth. So in some ways, just by doing that little bit of humming, we're a little more relaxed and open to what's to come. Some other ones that I've done in workshops, particularly during a phase where I invite students to frame their future topics. I'm a big fan of domain mapping, but before we actually do that, do bilateral drawing. Essentially bilateral drawing, and I have them do it with their eyes closed. You don't have to. You take a pen or pencil in both hands, and you just draw on a piece of paper, scribble, so forth. There's something that happens in the brain when you do it with both hands. It helps regulate and relax your nervous system. It's a powerful technique that's used in art therapy, actually. So I have the students do it with their eyes closed. So part of the reason I do it during the framing phase is when we think about how are we going to frame around the future topic, domain mapping or other means, we're drawing boundaries about what's included and what's not. And I wanted them to have an experiential sense of sometimes we do that not only intentionally, but unintentionally, and how that may come out and so forth. When it's time for horizon scanning, being aware of emerging change, it's easy for folks, and I've seen it when they're introduced to this, that change is happening out there, it's outside, or I got to Google it or what have you. Over 30 plus years of doing Zen meditation, one of the things that I realized is the power of just pausing and slowing down and just being aware of the change happening right in front of you, inside your body and out. So one of the things I'd like us to do is put your hands on the table or desk that you're on and your feet on the floor. And just bring attention to your feet and feel the floor underneath you, just giving you support. No matter what's happening in your life right now, it's always there. And I want you can keep your head straight, just lower your gaze right in front of you, a few inches from you. Just look down and just breathe. Don't try and breathe any particular way. Just notice your breath coming in and leaving out your nose. And then I'd like you to lift up your gaze and just look around your room or wherever you're at. And just with your eyes, see if you can identify 5 different things to look at. And after you're done seeing that, just bring attention to listening and see if you can hear like 4 different sounds or up to 4 different sounds. And then when you're done doing that, just use your hands, your fingers, or your toes and just try to feel like up to 3 different textures. Could be your clothes, could be the desk which you're sitting on, and so forth. And just feel it. And try to smell. See if you can identify perhaps 2 different smells in the room. And then taste, bring your attention to. Hopefully you're tasting something good. So what I found in actually doing this with students, they become more aware of what's happening on the periphery. Things that may have not stood out when they entered the room now kind of, oh, I didn't see that before, and so forth. So cultivating that awareness throughout the horizon scanning process, especially while you're looking at signals over a certain period of time, and sharing, our observations, I find super helpful. Another one that I like to do when it's time to actually imagine alternative futures is, if I've done the bilateral drawing, is have folks take their drawing, start coloring in the spaces, and pass it to the person next to them, and everybody starts iterating on everybody's drawing until it comes back to you. And then I'll ask folks in the room, one, how does it feel to see your original drawing change? And two, what were your expectations? And how do you feel if it didn't meet your expectations? What I love about this, one, I didn't realize how much some kids, even in college, love to draw. I didn't know that. But the collaboration. And I wanted to get them a real visceral sense of what emergent change can feel like unintentionally. As much as we feel like I'm doing this and you're doing that, it's through our relationship and our interactions, and how do we make that visible? So sometimes I like to use that as a warm up before actually, crafting the futures and so forth.
That's great.
Thank you. Another one I call, for lack of a better word, like a futures prism. Essentially, what I realized, I went down this rabbit hole of learning more about critical future studies and the work that Sohail and Ayatollah was doing then, back in the 80s, 90s, that 2000s. And I realized that there's so much when it comes to, let's say, a futures wheel, that the steep model or pestle is used as a lens. And it can be a helpful lens, especially when thinking about macro changes or implications. But I realize I'm working with students. I'm not limited by the scope of a project for a bunch of stakeholders. What other lenses can we use to think about and critique the very futures that we're imagining in a way that brings us to the level of understanding how people's bodies are impacted? So what I've done in workshops is had the students, I provided a list of maybe about 10 different critical theories: post-colonialism, disability studies, feminist theory, different ones. Not so much is it true or not, but as a lens for us to consider divergent ways of looking at our imagined futures. And I asked them to see which one resonates with them, pick one of the questions offered, then pick a question from one that doesn't resonate with you, just to stretch yourself. So, for example, there was a team working on AI in the future of healthcare, and a young lady picked feminist theory, particularly looking at their scenario from the lens of how women might become objectified or marginalized in this future. And she went to do her consequences on the future wheel through that lens. And it was fascinating what she revealed. Another team looked at AI in fitness centers through the lens of disability studies and started to ask the question, what if AI prescribed a fitness program for someone with no legs? Would that be traumatic? What would the ripple effects of that be? And that's when I realized that this was super helpful. So not only did they take the time to critique and look at their scenarios and have a discussion about the insights, but they also extended it to the implications in the futures wheel, which was fascinating. Another one, you see some students here from my last workshop. I'm a big fan of hands-on art making. I can think of no other fun way to really experience disruption except through happy accidents when making art. For that particular workshop, I actually brought in some found objects: a rock, a stone, a rock, piece of wood and a hardened leaf. And I said, imagine in 20 years, these 3 items are considered essential for human health and thriving. Describe what happened. So they did a futures wheel through an ethical framework lens, looking at how bad actors may come into the picture and so forth. They then imagined themselves in one of the consequences of that future. And if they envisioned harmful effects, what they could do to mitigate those effects. If they were beneficial, how they could advocate and express their first person narrative through a zine or artwork and so forth. And some of these folks had never done artwork before. And again, the happy accidents and the concepts behind the artwork was just thrilling, for me. So that led to my last kind of premise. I just realized that the way we perceive and interact with each other in our environment not only influences us, but is influenced by our bodily experience of change. So a few closing thoughts. So in conclusion, I feel an embodied approach to doing futures would enable us to acknowledge, accept, and leverage the wisdom in our bodies for inspiration, guidance, and support. And I feel like by foregrounding embodiment into the heart of our why, our how, and our what in futures work, we would also encourage a compassionate gaze on those who are most vulnerable and at risk in our deepest imaginings of later than now. So my gift, my offering, is I offer somatic futures as a concept, an ethic, a perspective, a dream, a wish for anticipating, envisioning, and crafting futures that feel lived in from the inside out. A way to critically, creatively, and somatically explore embodiment in emerging futures, whether real or imagined. And thank you. I did it within the hour, and there's plenty of time for questions, thoughts. Rodney, you're crazy. What are you doing here?
I feel like this is absolutely, it resonates with what I've been thinking of, because as I think I had a discussion with Rodney before when we first met on
Sure.
Zoom, was
Sure.
about the non-linearity